They say that in a mid-sized sawmill in 1900, operating 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, you could expect one worker to lose a finger or part of a finger every single day. Not every week, not every month, every day. That's 300 fingers per year, per mill. And there were thousands of sawmills operating across the United States. The math is grim. Tens of thousands of fingers, hands, arms, lost annually to machinery that had no guards, no safety features, no emergency stops. Circular saw blades 4 feet in diameter, spinning at 600 revolutions per minute, with teeth moving at over 100 miles per hour. Workers feeding lumber past those blades by hand, reaching within inches of the cutting edge. Working 12-hour shifts in sawdust so thick you could barely see, in noise so loud you couldn't hear a warning scream. And children, some as young as 8 years old, doing the same work, losing fingers at even higher rates because their hands were smaller and their judgment less developed. This was legal. This was normal. This was the cost of lumber, measured in severed digits and amputated limbs and lives destroyed. Today, every aspect of a 1900 sawmill operation would be illegal. Child labor laws, OSHA regulations, machinery guards, workers' compensation, all of it written in response to the carnage. But in 1900, none of that existed. The mills ran at full speed, the saws screamed, and the workers bled. This is the story of why sawmill workers lost fingers every single day. The machinery that took them, the jobs that were most dangerous, the children who worked and died, and why it took decades of mutilation before anyone in power decided it needed to stop. Let's start inside the mill, because you need to understand the environment to understand the scale of the danger. A sawmill in 1900 was a factory built around violence. At the center was the head saw, a massive circular blade, typically 4 to 6 feet in diameter, mounted on a carriage that moved logs through the cut. Around the head saw were the secondary saws, the edger, which trimmed the rough edges off the cut lumber, the trimmer, which cut boards to length, the gang saws, multiple blades mounted in a frame cutting multiple boards simultaneously, and the planer, which surfaced rough lumber to smooth dimensions. Every one of these machines was designed to cut wood with maximum efficiency, and every one of them would cut human flesh with the same efficiency and considerably less resistance. The mill was loud. Not just loud, but deafening. The scream of blades cutting through wood, the whine of the drive belts, the clank and crash of logs being moved, the thunder of finished lumber hitting the sorting tables. You couldn't have a conversation. You couldn't hear a warning shout. You communicated with hand signals, and if your hand was too close to a blade when you signaled, you lost it. The air was thick with sawdust. Pine, spruce, fir, whatever species was being cut, the sawdust hung in the air in a constant fog. It coated your lungs. It obscured your vision. It made the floor slick. And it was combustible. Sawdust fires and explosions were common, but we're focusing on the daily injuries, not the catastrophic disasters, though those happened too. The temperature varied wildly. In summer, the mills were ovens. Heat from the friction of the saws, heat from the steam engines that powered them, heat from the sun on metal roofs with no ventilation. Men worked in 100-degree heat, sweating through their clothes, dizzy from exhaustion and dehydration. In winter, the mills were cold. The saws generated heat locally, but the buildings were uninsulated, drafty. Your hands would be numb, and numb hands don't react fast when a saw blade grabs a board and kicks it back toward your face. The pace was relentless. Production quotas were set by management. The sawyer, the man who controlled the head saw carriage, was expected to produce a certain number of board feet per shift. The edger crews, the trimmer crews, the off-bearers, everyone down the line had to keep up. If you slowed down, you got yelled at, docked pay, or fired. So you worked fast. You fed lumber past the blades fast. You reached close to the spinning metal because reaching close was faster than reaching safe. And sometimes you miscalculated by an inch. The saws themselves were marvels of industrial brutality. The head saw, the primary blade that made the first cuts through the log, was a circular saw blade 4 to 6 feet in diameter, made of steel, with teeth cut into the edge. Each tooth was sharpened to a point, angled for cutting, and the entire blade was tensioned, stressed in a specific pattern so that it would run true at high speed. The blade was mounted on a mandrel driven by a belt from a steam engine or, later, an electric motor. It spun at 500 to 700 RPM, depending on the size. Do the math on a 6-foot diameter blade at 600 RPM. The circumference is about 18 feet. At 600 RPM, that's 18 times 600, 10,800 feet per minute. Divide by 60, that's 180 feet per second. The teeth are moving at over 100 miles per hour. There were no guards on the blade. A guard would block the operator's view of the cut. It would interfere with feeding the log. It would slow down production. So the blade spun, fully exposed, a 6-foot disc of steel and razors, and the sawyer stood next to it, controlling the carriage that pushed the log through. The sawyer's job was skilled. He decided how to cut the log to maximize yield, to avoid knots and defects, to produce the dimensions the market wanted. He controlled the carriage with levers, adjusting the position of the log, the speed of the feed, and he worked inches from the blade. When the log was pushed through and the blade exited the far side, the sawyer's hands were right there, steadying the log, adjusting the position for the next cut. If the log shifted, if it had internal tension and twisted as it was cut, if the blade hit a knot and kicked, the sawyer's hands were in the path. Finger loss at the head saw was common. A log would twist. The sawyer would reach to steady it. The blade would catch his hand. In the best case, he'd pull back and lose a fingertip. In the worst case, his hand would be pulled into the blade, and he'd lose fingers, the hand, part of the arm. The sawyer would scream, but no one would hear over the noise. He'd pull back, blood spraying, and someone would see and signal to shut down the steam. By the time the blade stopped, the damage was done. There are records, company ledgers, injury logs from mills that kept them. The Weyerhaeuser Mill in Everett, Washington, recorded 23 finger amputations in 1900. That's one mill, 1 year. The Georgia Pacific Mill in Louisiana recorded 31. These are just the injuries serious enough to be recorded, meaning amputations or crush injuries requiring medical attention. Minor cuts, lacerations, embedded splinters, those weren't recorded. They were expected. You bandaged your hand and kept working. But let's move to the edger, because if the head saw was dangerous, the edger was worse. The edger's job was to trim the rough edges off the lumber that came from the head saw. A log cut through the head saw produces slabs with bark edges, uneven widths. The edger had 2 or more circular saw blades mounted parallel, adjustable for width. The rough lumber was fed between the blades, and the edges were trimmed off, producing boards of uniform width. Feeding the edger was a manual job. A worker, the edger feeder, would grab a rough board, position it, and push it through the blades. The blades were spinning at high speed, exposed, with just enough space between them for the board. The feeder's hands had to guide the board, keep it straight, push it through. And the feeder's hands were inches from the blades, on both sides. If the board kicked, if it had a twist or a warp, if the feeder's grip slipped, his fingers went into the blade. Edger feeders lost fingers at a higher rate than any other job in the mill. The injury pattern was predictable. First, you'd lose a fingertip, the tip of your index or middle finger on your dominant hand, the hand closer to the blade. You'd wrap it, keep working, and you'd be more careful for a while. Then, weeks or months later, you'd have another moment of inattention, another board that kicked, and you'd lose more of the same finger or a different finger. Experienced edger feeders often had 3 or 4 fingers shortened or missing entirely. And they kept working because the alternative, was no job, no income, starvation for their families. The trimmer, the saw that cut boards to length, had a different danger profile. The trimmer was typically a swing saw or a pull saw, a circular blade that could be moved across the path of the lumber. The operator would position the board, pull the saw across to cut it, then push the cut piece forward. The danger was the speed. The trimmer had to keep up with the output of the edger. Boards came fast. The operator grabbed each one, positioned it, made the cut, pushed it forward, grabbed the next. The pace left no room for precision, and the saw, when it cut, produced force. If the blade caught the wood wrong, it could kick the board, send it flying, smash it into the operator's hands or face. Crushed fingers were common at the trimmer. The board would kick, the operator's hand would be between the board and the frame of the machine, and bones would break. Sometimes the hand was pulled into the saw. Sometimes the board itself, heavy green lumber, would smash fingers against the metal guides. The off-bearers, the workers who grabbed finished lumber as it came off the saws and stacked it, had a different set of injuries. The lumber was moving fast, heavy, rough. A 12-foot board, 2 inches thick and 12 inches wide, green lumber, weighed 50 to 60 pounds. The off-bearer had to grab it, control it, stack it. The boards came one after another, no pause, and if you didn't grab fast, the next board would jam up and the whole line would stop, and you'd get yelled at. So you grabbed fast. And the boards had splinters, rough edges, sometimes protruding knots. The splinters would drive into your hands, under your nails, deep into the meat of your palm. Minor ones you'd pull out and keep working. Deep ones would get infected. Some off-bearers lost fingers not to saws, but to infections that turned gangrenous, requiring amputation to save the hand or the life. The boards were also heavy enough to crush. If a stack tipped, if you were positioning a board and another one came off the saw and hit you, fingers got caught between boards. The weight would smash them flat. Compound fractures, crushed bones. Sometimes amputation was required not because the finger was cut off, but because it was destroyed. Then there was the planer. If you worked in a sawmill long enough and someone asked you what the most dangerous machine was, many would say the planer. The planer took rough lumber and surfaced it smooth using a rotating cutting head fitted with multiple blades. The lumber was fed into the machine on a conveyor, passed under the cutting head, and came out the other side smooth. Feeding the planer was a manual job in many mills. The feeder positioned the board and pushed it into the machine. The planer had feed rollers that grabbed the board and pulled it through. But the feed rollers could also grab anything else that touched them: clothing, gloves, hands. If the board kicked as it entered the planer, if it wasn't positioned right, the feeder would reach to adjust it. The feed rollers would grab his hand and pull it into the machine. The cutting head would hit the hand before anyone could react. In the best case, fingers were severed cleanly. In the worst case, the hand was pulled further in, degloved, the skin stripped off, the bones crushed by the rollers and mangled by the blades. There are accounts, medical records, from doctors who treated sawmill injuries, describing degloving injuries from planers. The skin of the hand pulled off like a glove, leaving raw muscle and bone. These injuries were often fatal, not immediately, but from infection and shock. Even if the victim survived, the hand was useless, amputation often necessary. The saw filer had a different kind of danger. His job was to maintain the saws, sharpen the teeth, adjust the tension. He worked with the blades when they were stopped, removed from the machines. But a circular saw blade, even when stationary, is dangerous. The teeth are sharp. The blade is under tension, stressed steel. If the tension is released wrong, the blade can warp, snap, send fragments flying. Saw filers lost fingers to cuts from teeth while handling blades. They lost eyes to metal fragments when blades failed during tensioning. And they developed respiratory diseases from inhaling metal dust from the grinding wheels used to sharpen the teeth. Now let's talk about who these workers were, because understanding who did this work explains why it continued despite the horrific injury rates. The workforce in a sawmill in 1900 was a mix of immigrants, rural poor, and the desperate. Scandinavian immigrants, Finns and Swedes and Norwegians, were common in the Pacific Northwest mills. Italian and Polish immigrants worked the mills in the Northeast. In the South, it was poor whites and black laborers, often working in segregated crews. These were men and boys, and some women in finishing roles, who had no alternatives. The wage was $1.50 to $2.50 per day for a 12-hour shift. That's $9 to $15 for a 6-day week. Roughly $270 to $450 today. It wasn't much, but it was more than farm labor, and it was cash, not barter or credit. The workers lived in mill towns, in company housing if they were lucky, in shacks and boarding houses if they weren't. They bought food and supplies at the company store, often at inflated prices. By the end of the week, after paying for housing, food, and necessities, they had little left. But they had enough to survive, barely, and to send a little money home if they were supporting family elsewhere. They stayed because leaving meant having no income at all. There were no unemployment benefits, no social safety net. If you quit or got fired, you starved. So you worked, and you accepted the injuries as part of the job. The culture in the mills normalized the mutilation. Experienced workers, men who'd been in the mills for years, all had missing fingers. It was a visible marker of experience. You'd look at a man's hands and know immediately how long he'd been working saws. New workers had all their fingers. Veterans had stubs. It was joked about. Dark humor, the kind that people use to cope with constant danger. But underneath the jokes was the reality that everyone knew. You would lose a finger eventually. It was a question of when, not if. And then there were the children. Child labor in sawmills in 1900 was common, legal, and deadly. Children as young as 8 or 10 worked in the mills, though 12 to 14 was more typical. They worked the same 12-hour shifts as the adults. They were employed because they were cheap. A child could be paid 50 cents to $1 a day, half or less of an adult wage. And families needed the income. A family with 4 or 5 children couldn't survive on the father's wage alone. The children worked. The jobs children were given were described as light work by the mill owners. Off-bearing, stacking, sweeping sawdust, helping position boards. But light work in a sawmill was still dangerous work. Children were off-bearers, grabbing heavy boards, stacking them, risking crushed hands. They swept sawdust, working near moving machinery, under conveyors, around drive belts. They helped feed edgers and trimmers, their small hands reaching past blades just like the adults. And they were injured at higher rates than adults. Children have less experience, less judgment, less understanding of danger. They're smaller, so their hands are closer to the blades when handling the same size boards. They're weaker, so they lose control of boards more easily. And they're more likely to be exhausted, working 12-hour shifts on inadequate sleep and nutrition. The injury records show it. The Lewis Hine photographs, taken in the early 1900s as part of the National Child Labor Committee's documentation efforts, show children in mills. Some of the photos show children with bandaged hands, missing fingers. Hine's notes describe a boy, age 10, who lost 2 fingers to an edger in a North Carolina mill. A girl, age 12, who lost her hand to a planer in a Georgia mill. These weren't isolated incidents. They were routine. Children also died. A 9-year-old boy in a Washington state mill in 1903 was killed when he was pulled into a belt drive while sweeping underneath it. An 11-year-old girl in a Louisiana mill in 1905 was killed when a stack of lumber tipped and crushed her. A 13-year-old boy in a Michigan mill in 1907 was killed when he fell into the log pond and drowned, his body pulled under by the current created by the log conveyor. The companies justified child labor with the claim that it kept families together, that it taught children the value of work, that it was necessary for the family's economic survival, all of which was true in a narrow sense. Families did need the income. But the underlying cause was the wages paid to adults were insufficient to support a family, and the companies benefited from cheap child labor, so they had no incentive to raise adult wages. What happened after a worker lost a finger tells you everything about the system. There was no workers' compensation. If you were injured on the job, the company had no legal obligation to pay for medical treatment, to compensate you for lost wages, or to provide disability payments. The immediate response to a severed finger was rough first aid. A tourniquet, a rag wrapped tight to stop the bleeding. If the finger was completely severed, it was discarded. Some mills had a bucket, literally a bucket, where severed fingers and other bits were thrown. At the end of the shift, the bucket was emptied. If the injury was bad enough that you couldn't continue working, you were sent home or to a doctor if there was one nearby, and if you could pay. Many workers couldn't pay. A doctor's visit cost $1 or more, and suturing or amputation cost additional. For a worker making $2 a day, that was unaffordable. So injuries were treated at home. Kitchen table amputations, a saw or a knife used to finish what the mill saw started, removing the mangled remains of a finger to prevent infection. Whiskey for anesthetic if you were lucky, nothing if you weren't. Infection was common. Antibiotics didn't exist. An infected finger could turn into an infected hand, then sepsis, then death. Even if you survived, recovery meant weeks without work, without income. The company didn't hold your job. If you couldn't work, you were replaced. When you recovered, you had to find a new job, and you were competing with able-bodied workers. A man missing fingers or a hand was at a disadvantage. Many injured workers ended up in poverty, unable to work, dependent on family or charity. Some became beggars. Some died of starvation or related illnesses. The company's position was that injuries were the result of worker carelessness. If you got hurt, it was your fault for not being careful enough. This was the legal standard at the time. To hold a company liable for an injury, you had to prove negligence, that the company had failed in some duty of care. But companies argued they had no duty to install guards on saws because guards weren't standard practice. They had no duty to limit shifts to reasonable hours because 12-hour shifts were standard. They had no duty to exclude children because child labor was legal. So in court, if a worker even had the resources to sue, the company won. The system was designed to protect capital, not labor. So why did it continue? Why did the mutilation persist for decades? Economics. Installing guards on saws cost money. Not a lot, but enough that it affected the bottom line. A saw guard reduced visibility and slowed down the feed rate slightly, which reduced production. In a competitive industry with thin margins, companies that installed guards were at a disadvantage compared to companies that didn't, so none of them did. Replacement labor was unlimited. For every worker who was injured and couldn't continue, there were 10 more desperate men and boys willing to take the job. Immigration was at peak levels. Rural areas were depopulating as farming mechanized. The supply of workers exceeded demand, which kept wages low and gave companies leverage. If you complained about conditions, you were fired and replaced within hours. There was no effective regulation. Some states had factory inspection laws, but they were weakly enforced. Inspectors were few, often underfunded, and sometimes corrupt. Mills in remote areas were rarely inspected at all, and the laws that existed were minimal. They might require basic fire exits or restrictions on child labor under age 10, but they didn't mandate machinery guards or limit shift length or require medical facilities. Union organizing was crushed. Attempts to unionize sawmill workers in the late 1800s and early 1900s were met with violence. Company guards, local police, and strikebreakers were used to break strikes. Organizers were blacklisted, beaten, sometimes killed. The Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, made inroads in the lumber industry in the 1910s but even they faced massive resistance. It wasn't until the 1930s, with the New Deal and the National Labor Relations Act, that unions gained real power. And companies had no financial incentive to improve safety. They didn't pay for injuries. They didn't face lawsuits they couldn't win. Insurance for the companies was cheap because the insurance companies didn't cover the workers, they covered the property. A fire or equipment damage was insured. A worker's hand wasn't. What finally changed it was a combination of progressive-era reforms, insurance industry pressure, and union organizing. The progressive movement of the early 1900s brought attention to industrial conditions. Journalists, muckrakers, wrote about factory injuries and child labor. Photographers like Lewis Hine documented the conditions. Public opinion began to shift. State governments started passing stronger factory safety laws. Wisconsin in 1911, New York in 1913. These laws mandated machinery guards, limited child labor, required basic safety standards. Workers' compensation laws started to appear. Washington State in 1911, California in 1913. These laws made companies financially responsible for workplace injuries, creating an economic incentive to improve safety. If a company had to pay for every severed finger, suddenly installing saw guards made financial sense. The insurance industry, facing rising payouts under the new workers' comp laws, began requiring safety improvements as a condition of coverage. Companies that didn't install guards faced higher premiums or couldn't get insurance at all. Union pressure increased. The IWW and later the AFL organized lumber workers, struck for better conditions, and won concessions. Slowly. By the 1920s, sawmills were safer. Not safe, but safer. Saws had guards. Shift lengths were reduced to 10 hours, then 8. Child labor was banned in most states. Workers' comp provided at least some financial support for injuries. But the change was slow and uneven. Small mills in remote areas continued to operate with minimal safety standards into the 1930s and 40s. It wasn't until OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, was created in 1970 that federal enforcement of safety standards became consistent. Today, a modern sawmill is unrecognizable compared to 1900. The saws have guards, interlocks, emergency stops. Workers wear protective equipment. Shift lengths are regulated. Child labor is federally banned. Injury rates are a fraction of what they were. But the legacy remains. The regulations, the guards, the workers' comp systems. All of it was written in response to the tens of thousands of fingers lost, the thousands of hands amputated, the hundreds of workers killed. Every safety standard exists because someone was injured or killed in its absence. So here's to the sawmill workers of 1900. Here's to the sawyers who stood next to blades spinning at 100 miles per hour with no guards. Here's to the edger feeders who fed boards with their hands inches from the cut. Here's to the off-bearers who grabbed heavy lumber until their hands were mangled. Here's to the planer feeders who lost hands to machines that pulled them in and shredded them. Here's to the children, 8, 10, 12 years old, working 12-hour shifts, losing fingers, losing lives. Here's to the men who lost fingers and kept working because they had no choice. Here's to the ones who lost hands and lost their jobs and ended up in poverty. Here's to the ones who died from infections, from accidents, from the grinding brutality of a system that valued production over people. They built the houses we live in. The wood that framed those houses came from mills where workers bled every day. The boards in old buildings, if you could trace their origin, came from logs cut by men who lost fingers to make them. And the system that allowed it, that legally permitted children to work next to unguarded saws, that absolved companies of responsibility for injuries, that treated workers as replaceable components. That system persisted because it was profitable. It changed only when it became more expensive to maintain than to reform. The finger loss, the mutilations, the deaths, they were externalities, costs borne by the workers and their families, not by the companies or the consumers. We live in a world built on that externalized suffering, and we owe it to the workers who paid the price to remember that safety regulations, workers' rights, child labor laws, all of it was fought for, bled for, and won against the fierce resistance of the companies that benefited from the status quo. Every saw guard in a modern mill exists because workers in 1900 didn't have them and lost fingers every single day until someone, finally, decided that was unacceptable. That's the legacy. Not just the lumber. The cost of the lumber, measured in severed fingers and broken bodies and lives destroyed. Remember that. Remember them.